Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. Today we have a big job. I'm talking big job. We are going to show you how to replace a clutch on a 3rd gen 4Runner. At some point that 5-speed clutch is going to go out on you. It's going to wear out. It's a wear part. You're going to have to change it at some point. So you're going to have to pull your transmission and transfer case out. You're going to have to get in there and replace the clutch. Maybe resurface the flywheel, maybe replace the flywheel, and there's a lot of other associated parts like pilot bearing, throwout bearing, shift fork, that sort of thing. And we're gonna show you how to replace all that because we have a special guest. His name is Dan. He hails from Kirkwood near Lake Tahoe, and he was nice enough to drive all the way down to San Jose to let us use his truck to make this video for you to benefit from. I am now going to turn it over to Dan, and Dan's going to go over all the parts he bought for this job and explain a few things about why he bought the parts from certain places rather than others. And yeah, so anyways, without further ado, here is Dan. Fear the beard.
Hey guys, Dan here. I'm just going to quickly go over the parts that I selected for this job. I'm going to start with the centerpiece here. This is a Center Force Stage 2 clutch. I opted to go for this clutch over the OEM just because I got it on some pretty high recommendation from some people of opinions that I respect in the four-wheeling world there. This one seemed to check all the boxes as far as a vehicle that I rock crawl and go four-wheeling pretty aggressively, but it's also my daily driver as well. Something to note on this clutch system here, or this kit rather, from Center Force, again this is the Stage 2, is this what Center Force calls the centrifugal weight balancing system. So you might not see this on other clutch kits, but you do want to leave this in. This is part of the balancing system for these forks as well. Moving on from the clutch kit, I did opt to get a brand new flywheel. I got this from Marlin Crawler, somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 to $150. I figured if we're going to all the trouble to pull the transmission out, I would rather just put a new part in there as opposed to resurfacing the old flywheel, which is okay to do too. I think probably a lot of people would opt to just go to a machine shop. That might just run you 20 bucks or something like that if you were to take that to a mechanic, and they would do that pretty quickly and cheaply for you. Now down to the smaller stuff. One of the other big things I think to do if you're planning on pulling the transmission out of your 4Runner is to go ahead and do the rear main seal. Additionally, I've got some other parts from Marlin Crawler. These are going to be shifter seats, heavy duty bad boys here. This one's going to be for the transmission, and this one will be for the transfer case. You can actually do this without dropping the transmission from the interior of the vehicle. Probably just going to be a little bit easier, and again, if you're going to all the work to pull the transmission out, it's worth your time to try to replace any of those high wear parts. It's possible you want to do that, especially if you're feeling some looseness in your shifter there. Next up, we've got flywheel bolts, a total of 8. There seems to be some up in the air. People have different opinions on whether you should put new bolts in or if you can just reuse the old ones. I don't know if there's a right or a wrong answer, but again, something that's this important, these were relatively cheap. I think maybe $1 or $2 from Toyota is what I paid for them. So I always like to put new parts in whenever I have the opportunity, but I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with reusing those parts. Next up, we've got the pilot bearing, which is pretty standard again for doing any clutch job. You'll find a lot of other videos on some different interesting creative methods on removing these. I think notoriously this is typically one of the more challenging steps of this process, is getting this bearing out. Unless you've got a puller or some other specialty tool that has a small enough that you can get inside the inner diameter of that bearing. Alternatively, I see people pack behind the bearing with mixtures of grease. Bread seems to be actually a pretty common one that is surprisingly effective. And then using a bolt that matches, or a socket even, or an extension that matches the inside diameter of that bearing to then pound it out. And it might take a couple kind of retries. You pack it, you pound it, you pack it some more, you pound it again to finally to get that to pop out. So it'll be interesting to see. We do have hopefully the correct tool for the job, so hopefully this should be a relatively painless process for us. So we have the fork assembly here. The part number will be in the description of the video. And again, this is certainly a part that the transmission does need to be removed in order to replace. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. You can see some wear on the pivot point of this clutch fork over time. My 4Runner has 170 some thousand miles on it. So since we're getting in there, we're just gonna get that part in there and set ourselves up for hopefully a long and prosperous life. Last but not least, it's a throwout bearing. Again, I got this from Center Force as well. Part number will be in the description. So yeah, that's pretty standard. This is what it looks like. It's got a little clip in there, and basically that's going to seat into the fork, something like that. Obviously you'll see what that looks like a lot better later in the video. So for now, that covers all the parts that we've got, and let's go ahead and get started.
Because first gen Tacomas are very similar drivetrain and front suspension wise with third gen 4Runners, this is pretty much going to be the same procedure for a first gen Tacoma. So if you have one of those rigs, this video is going to benefit you if you have a 5-speed transmission. With all that said, we're going to get the truck in the garage, we're going to get it supported on jack stands, get it up pretty high to give us plenty of room to get underneath there and work comfortably. It's still not going to be very comfortable because we're going to be on our backs underneath the rig in tight conditions. Obviously, if you have a friend with a hydraulic lift or you have a garage you could use, that would be a lot easier. But we are going to be working on our backs. But I think it's kind of cool that we're showing you this way because most of you aren't going to have a hydraulic lift at your homes or maybe have access to one. Showing you the hard way is probably going to be more beneficial to most of our viewers. So, we're going to get started. Perfect. For this job as a reference, in addition to looking at some existing write-ups on how to replace a clutch on one of these rigs, we're going to use a Toyota factory service manual. This one happens to be for a 2000 4Runner, but one for a first gen Tacoma or any of the years for the third gen 4Runner would work because there's not big differences. There might be some small differences between the electrical connectors you'll have to disconnect, between some of the earlier model and later model transfer cases and transmissions, but for the most part the steps are going to be the same. The pages we're going to be using out of this manual are going to be number 1 in the MT section, which stands for manual transmission. With the 5VZ motor, you have the R150 F as in Frank transmission. If you happen to have the 3RZ 4-cylinder motor, you're going to have the W59 transmission. So we're going to be using these pages, which it goes through the steps of showing you how to disconnect everything so you can get the transmission and transfer case out of the rig to expose the clutch. We're also going to be using the pages out of the factory service manual. They are the CL pages, which is for the clutch. They're going to let us know how to replace the clutch and pressure plate, the flywheel, the shift fork, the throwout bearing, the pilot bearing, and anything else I'm forgetting. So all those pages we're going to be using. And finally, we're going to be using one page out of the transfer case pages titled TR, and that's going to show us the steps to remove the transfer case shifter. So those are all the pages we're going to use out of the factory service manual for this job. As part of this job, we're going to be disconnecting a lot of electrical connectors on the transfer case and transmission. And so it's just best practice to disconnect all power to the rig so you don't short something out. So we're going to take off the negative battery terminal off the battery. It's usually a 10 millimeter. He's got an aftermarket connector, so this is actually a 12, but it's usually a 10. Get it off there. Okay, that's loose enough. It should be able to twist off. And then just make sure it's not going to be able to contact back with the battery, so stuff it in somewhere where it's not going to reconnect itself. Okay, we're good to go.
So the first thing we're going to tackle here is disconnecting the transfer case shifter and the transmission shifter here. We're just going to lift up the top of our console and pop this loose, just like that. Okay, so something to be aware of is that, of course, everyone knows that the center consoles are going to vary a little bit from year to year. I believe it's 96 to 98. Is going to have a different center console, and so as a result of that, there's going to be some electrical connections that you're going to need to be aware of as you're pulling this out. So use caution as you're pulling this out, and just imagine that there's going to be some harnesses back here that may or may not have variable amounts of slack. So you certainly do not want to damage those as you're removing this. Pull it out a little bit just so you can get to those connections. Next up, we're going to focus on this black trim surrounding the shift knobs here. So we're going to unscrew these knobs, which are just going to be simple turning. It might take a little bit of hand strength to break them loose initially. There's one. And this is now going to allow us to remove the leather boot here. So at this point, there is going to be 4 screws that we're going to need to remove. Here, 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 and there. And that's going to allow us to dislodge this plate, which essentially sandwiches these rubber boots, and is going to allow us to pull those up and gain access to the top of the transmission. So this metal plate here is likely going to be seated pretty well with the body of the vehicle. I was able to successfully just get my fingers on the rear of this plate, break it loose a little bit, and it looks like with just a little bit of finagling here, getting it sideways, helping these rubber boots along the way, being aware of any wiring that I might be hanging up on. I certainly don't want to be damaging that. There we go. And turning it sideways slightly as you bring it off is certainly going to help. And there we go. Now we have access to the top of the transmission and the transfer case, which looks like it's in serious need of a good cleaning. Okay, so I've got a pick tool here, and I'm going to use this to get underneath this rubber here, get my finger under it, and then ride this pick around, pulling up as I go. It's seated down on a pretty nice metal lip there, so that can be a challenge if you don't have this tool. So this is highly advisable. I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing for the transfer case. So now that I've got these rubber boots loose here, I'm gonna go ahead and slide these boots up the shaft. And there is a snap ring that we can see right here. You can see the ends of it, and we're going to need to release that in order to remove the transfer case selector. The transmission shifter, that's just going to require some downward force and a counterclockwise rotation to remove it. So this seating here is where the factory service manual specifies that that downward force needs to be applied. Push down and rotate counterclockwise, and now I felt that, look, this seating has come up and now it's loose, and sure enough you can see that spring down in there. So this is just going to be removed just like that. Something else that's potentially advisable, that's a high wear item in this area, is going to be this bushing right here. This one seems to have a moderate amount of wear. I wish honestly that I had ordered this to have it here in time to replace this while we're doing this job, but as you can see, it does not require dropping of the transmission to get to this, and you can get to this fairly easily within 10 or 15 minutes of work to replace it down the road, in addition to those other Marlin crawler shifter seats that we went over earlier. We're going to go ahead and remove this retaining ring on the transfer case selector. So I have this tool. These are snap ring pliers, and these are definitely worth having. Theoretically, you could do this with just regular needle nose pliers and you'd probably be okay, but this is probably a good excuse for you to go ahead and add some snap ring pliers to your toolbox. There we go, and it comes out just that easily. So something to note here, these shifter seats, it's entirely possible that when you go to perform this same job that these could be broken apart into smaller pieces, they could be crumbling, they could be dried out, and thus the risk of those particles dropping into your transmission, into your transfer case can be pretty high. So it's worth taking precautions, whether it's getting a paper towel down in there to prevent that from happening. That's definitely something that you'll want to consider. Again, I'm going to use this pick tool to pull out this seat. I'm gonna grab it just like that. This one actually seems to be in okay shape, but the Marlin crawler seats are going to be made of a much more durable material. Look at how dirty and how much gunk there is here on the transfer case selector. In an effort to prevent contamination of particles into your transmission or transfer case, I'm gonna just use this glove here and I'm gonna try to get it down into that hole without pushing too much of that gunk down in there, so that I have some manner of protection, as then I can get in there with a various tool, what have you, to try to pull out. Look at all this nasty gunk here. You can just imagine what that would do floating in the oil and in amongst your gears. That would be not good at all. We're going to take some time to get this cleaned up here, and we'll continue once we've got this cleaned up nicely.
The next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the rear drive shaft and the front drive shaft. Before you do that, you want to make match marks. The most important match marks you want to make is the slip yoke with the main drive shaft, also known as the propeller shaft, because this whole unit is balanced, and if you get it put back wrong, you're going to have a unbalanced drive shaft. The factory service manual also recommends making match marks where the U-joint flange connects up to the third member flange for both the rear and front drive shaft. So we made those match marks too, so we can get it back in the same position we took it off. The first fasteners we're going to work on is the rear drive shaft connection to the transfer case. What you want to loosen is the nut. You don't want to try to loosen the bolt head, because this is a serrated bolt head that fits tightly into the flange of the transfer case. So I'm going to get on here with a long 14mm box end wrench and loosen these. To help me, what Dan is going to be doing is he's going to be working the parking brake for me. I'm going to get it in the position to get one of the nuts loose. I'm going to loosen it, and then Dan's going to release the parking brake. I'm going to turn it to where I want to get the next one loose, and then he's going to reset it. If you're doing this by yourself, you'd have to get out from underneath the rig multiple times, or you can try to figure out some way to wedge something in there to hold it steady to where you can loosen them. All right, so is it set, Dan?
Yes.
Parking brake set, it's tight. Okay, that one's loose. Release the parking brake. I rotate the next one in position. Okay, set it.
Engaged.
Loosen that one. Loosen it.
Disengaged.
Set it.
Engaged.
Okay, that one's loose. Loosen it.
Disengaged.
Set it.
Engaged.
Okay, they're all loose. Now I can get these all off by hand. Now we're working on the fasteners that attach the drive shaft to the third member. These are different than the front fasteners. It's an actual bolt that you can take out. So the bolt slides in from the front going towards the rear, and you have a nut and a washer on the back side. I'm just utilizing two big 14mm box end wrenches because these are fairly tight. They're somewhere in the 53-pound range. And I tried to use my little DeWalt impact gun, but it wasn't doing the job. I have to do it the hard way with strength. Now that I have them all loose, I can take them off by hand. I've got 3 of the bolts and nuts off. Before I take the last one off, it could be a good precaution to maybe take some baling wire and support the weight of the drive shaft, so when you do take this one out, it's not going to fall on you and hurt you. But usually these take a little bit of persuasion, and from experience I know that it's most likely not going to drop out. I'm going to have to tap on this with a plastic mallet or rubber mallet to break it free from the flange, so I'm not really going to worry about it. But like I said, for a safety factor, you could tie this up just to make sure it doesn't fall on you. Now that we have all the fasteners out, I'm going to tap on this rear connection first, break it free, and then we're going to work on the connection at the transfer case. So I just got a regular old plastic mallet. I'm going to tap on this and break it free. Right like that. It's pretty easy. I'm just going to let this drape here for a second, and it might go all the way to the ground. Now, if you did take that step and supported the rear of the drive shaft with baling wire, you wouldn't have to do what I'm doing now, but I want to take a little bit of weight off the connection at the transfer case. So I'm just placing this between my knees, and then now I'm going to hit the front connection to break it free from the transfer case with my plastic mallet. It gave way. I'm going to slide it back off the studs, and then I could just bring this down, bench press it, and then put it off to the side. And now we got the rear drive shaft out of the way. To get the nuts loose for the connection of the front drive shaft to the transfer case flange, the way we're holding it steady so we can loosen these 14mm nuts is I have a pry bar stuck between the yoke. So literally, once I have a little pressure on it, I can use both hands on the 14mm box end wrench. So I'm gonna loosen it. Okay, that's loose. And then now all I have to do is take the pry bar out, rotate it, and then get it reset. You have to note that you have the Zerk fitting there, so you don't want to be prying against the Zerk fitting. You just want to be prying against the strong points of the flange. So don't break off your Zerk fitting, and then don't hit any electrical connectors. So you have to know where that end of the pry bar is resting. It's not going to break anything. So I got it set again, and then I'm going to break free the next one. Okay, that's against there. Okay, you get the idea. We're going to do the same with the remaining two. We're now working on disconnecting the fasteners that attach the front drive shaft to the front differential. We found on this one my little DeWalt gun was up to the task and it could loosen the bolts. What I have going on here is I have a long box end wrench holding the nut on the backside, and I'm getting on the bolt head with the impact gun. If you don't have an impact gun, or you found your impact gun can't do it, you could use a box end or open end wrench on the backside. Turn it to where the wrench is being held against the bell housing, holding it for you, and then you can get on the bolt head with a socket or another box end wrench, and you can loosen it.
So something that's really important to note when you're disassembling many parts off of the vehicle is to make sure that you are as methodically as possible logging each piece of hardware with as much detail as possible. As you can see here, we've been doing this all along here. Here's just an example of the hardware that's coming off of the front drive shaft at the front differential, and then here we have the hardware that's coming off of the front drive shaft at the transfer case. That way, when you're going to reassemble, there's no question in what goes where, especially I think there's a total of 8 or 7 bolts that are coming out of the front of the bell housing. Some of those are longer than other ones, so at that point it's even important to designate the exact location of each of those bolts with as much detail as possible to make the reassembly as painless as possible.
The factory service manual doesn't say anything about removing the sway bar, but as you can see in relation to the transmission, it looks like it might get in our way a little bit of doing the job. So we're going to remove the sway bar. We already have a video showing how to do this, so to save some time in this video, we're not going to show it, but it's pretty easy. You got fasteners for the bushings on both sides, and then you got a nut for both connections to the end links, and then the thing is free. It's really simple, but click on the link above if you need more detail on knowing how to remove this sway bar from the rig. Now that we have the drive shafts and the sway bar out of our way, we're now going to work on getting the wiring harness and all the electrical connectors disconnected from the transmission and transfer case. The first ones we're working on are a post type of connector that connects the wiring harness to the top of the transmission and transfer case. They are a simple pull tab that you have to pull and then pull the connector off the post. Dan is actually accessing one of them from the inside of the vehicle. You just saw him pull it off right there. So he's going right through the shifter access that we took off at the beginning of the video. The next one, to give you a reference, here's the fill plug on the side of the transmission on the driver's side. I'm going to travel up, and then if I can get the lighting right, you can see this connector right here. Again, this is like a post type of connector. He's going to use a little pick tool to pull the tab out so we can slide this wiring harness off the post here. So again, he's coming in from the shifter hole and he's reaching his hand in there to get onto that tab. And there you go. You saw him able to slide it off. So we're working on the rear O2 sensor connector. You can see that this one's zip tied up, but that's because the normal mount that it was connected to broke. So you'd have to slide it off a post first in order to be able to get a little bit more room to get your hand in here to get the connector disconnected. So I'm going to cut this zip tie and then get this down in a position to where I can get my hands on there easier. This is the push tab you have to push, and you might find it a little stiff because it's got grip behind it, but I'm going to try to push on it with my thumb and hold the female connector and try to wiggle this loose, and it's fighting me. Just like the other O2 connector, we found that using a pliers is going to help us. This right angle needle nose pliers is just going to assist us by holding the clip down far enough to where I can wiggle it out with my other hand. So I got it depressed, and then I can wiggle this out, and boom, we got it out. You just have to be really careful using pliers on plastic clips that you don't break the connector. That would be a bad thing. We're on the passenger side of the transmission. We have a connector that's basically kind of close to the catalytic converter. The tab you need to push is on the front side. You need to push it up towards the bottom of the body. Get my right hand onto the push tab, hold the other side with my left hand and pull backwards, and then now we have that connector disconnected. The next connector we're going to disconnect is on the driver's side. The push tab is right here where my thumb is. I'm pointing to it, pushed in towards the connector, and then I'm going to pull backwards. And this is actually connected onto a post right here, so I don't necessarily have to hold this. I got it going, and it just slides right off, and you can see that this part is still connected to the post that it's holding onto. We're now coming in from the driver's side again. We have this little plastic clip that fits into this metal bracket. What I did is I got on here with a right angle set of needle nose pliers, and I compressed the sides, these two sides, left to right, and then I was able to squeeze and push up at the same time, and then now the wiring harness is free of that bracket. The last connector we have to disconnect is on the passenger side. We have to push this tab inboard, and then we can pull back on it. This one's a pretty easy one to get free, and boom, goes the dynamite. It's off. With all the connectors loose, and since the wiring harness does come in from the driver's side, I'm going to feed the connectors that were on the passenger side over the top of the transmission and transfer case, and I'm going to work the wiring harness out this direction.
So I'm feeding it through on the right-hand passenger side.
Now, if you wanted to, this could be something that could help you when you're getting it back together. You could put a piece of painter's tape and just make a note, say, these connectors need to go over the top of the transmission and towards the passenger side. So we might do that just so we don't forget and waste time trying to figure out how the harness goes back over the top of the transmission.
Okay, so now we've moved on to the driver's side of the bell housing, and we're going to be focusing on the clutch slave cylinder and hydraulic line attaching to the clutch slave cylinder. Something that's really nice about the way Toyota designed this is the fact that we have an external slave cylinder, and there's only going to be 4 12mm bolts that we're going to focus on here. Bear in mind, you do not need to open up that hydraulic system. It can stay closed during the course of this project if you so choose. Now, obviously, if you're taking this opportunity to replace your slave cylinder, then you're going to need to disconnect the hydraulic line, and that's going to involve bleeding after the fact. We will not be doing that in this go around. The 4 12mm bolts are going to be the first one here, which is the bracket attaching the hydraulic line to the bell housing. So there's one, and then there's a second one. If we follow the hydraulic line up here to the top, there's another bracket, same 12mm, and then there's another 2 12mm attaching the slave cylinder to the driver's side exterior of the bell housing. Most are fairly accessible with just a socket. Okay, so now we have some play here in the hydraulic line and the slave cylinder. Just like that. So now that these are disconnected, we'll certainly need to keep an eye on these as we're lowering the transmission and bell housing to make sure that they don't get hung up at all, but they're no longer connected. So we'll just need to guide these away as we're lowering the transmission and bell housing.
We're in the passenger side front wheel well. We removed the passenger tire to get it out of our way. Now we're going to go about disconnecting the starter. You need to disconnect the power connection, which is right down here. And normally there's a little plastic cover that's over the top of this connection, but Dan's truck is missing it. So you can see I have a little flex head gear wrench ratchet with a 13 millimeter socket. Now I'm not 100% sure that all of these are 13, but it happens to be on Dan's truck. And I'm gonna get on here with the socket and then lefty loosey and loosen the sucker. So now that I have the nut off, I can slide the power connection off the post, and then now that's free. And then I'm gonna go for this connector right here, which some people struggle with, but hopefully I'm not gonna struggle too much. So the connector that you have to disconnect is right behind the connector for the power to the starter. There's a push tab on the bottom. You have to push up and then pull towards the front of the vehicle. It's a little bit hard to get your arms in there. If you've got big meat hooks, you might have trouble, but I pushed on it and then pulled back and I was able to free it. So it might be a little bit of a test of patience, but this is the connector you have to disconnect. Now we have both the connections disconnected. Now we have to work on the bolts that attach the starter to the bell housing. Depending on your year, you might not have this exhaust bracket in the way to get to this bolt right here for the lower starter bolt. You can see that the previous owner or mechanic decided, I'm not going to remove this bracket, I'm just going to cut it out with a blowtorch. So we don't really suggest doing that. If you can get these bolts loose, just take the bracket out. This one was pretty tight. I had to use my impact gun to break it free, so maybe that's why the previous guy just said screw it and I'm going to cut the bracket. I got on here with a 14 millimeter impact socket and my big DeWalt impact gun, and I loosened this one. These I'm just going to get on here with a regular ratchet, and I already tested one and it broke free, no problem. So we're going to get these 3 fasteners off and get this bracket out of the way. Okay, I'm just going to zip this one out the rest of the way with my gun. Now I transition to my big flex head gear wrench ratchet with a deep 14 millimeter impact socket, and I'm going to break these free. You don't need a deep socket, you just need a 14 millimeter socket. Got that one loose, got that one loose. Feels like I just get them out with my hand, and I can. Long freaking bolt. Oh, you get the idea. This one's fighting me. It looks like it's going to take a while to back this one out. It's a little sticky, but we're just going to get this other bolt out. Okay, so here's the 2 14 millimeter bolts we have to remove to get the starter out. This is the upper one right here. The lower one is right here. Now, in that previous video where I show you how to remove the starter and replace the solenoid contacts and plunger, I ended up using a bunch of long extensions so I can get way backward to where I can get more room to turn the ratchet. What I just tested is I got on here with my big 1/2-inch drive flex head gear wrench ratchet that has 120 click points, and I have just enough room because of all those click points of engagement that I could actually turn it in this space right here. So I'm going to get onto the bolt with a 14 millimeter deep socket with my 1/2-inch drive, and I'm going to start loosening these. Now I'm going to get on the bottom one and break this one free. And I'd have to say these were kind of loose. They weren't tightened properly. Okay, these are both loose. Now I should be able to get on here with maybe a little gun and release them the rest of the way. So what I'm doing is I'm reaching around the front of the coilover, reaching my right hand and supporting the weight of the starter while I now back out the bottom bolt with my Milwaukee ratchet. Okay, I've got this one out, and then now I'm going to try to go for the top one. It looks like I can do this one with my hand, but I think I'm going to try to get my Milwaukee in there also. I need a little bit of longer extension here. I've got my Milwaukee with the short 3/8 extension and short 14 millimeter socket, and I'm going to back the top bolt out. Again, I'm supporting the weight of the starter with my right hand. Now the upper bolt, and you'll notice that the upper bolt is shorter than the bottom bolt. And then because we're not going to replace the solenoid contacts and plunger, we're just going to let this starter rest in this space right here. We're just going to let it sit in here. This seems pretty secure. Okay, that's good. So the next thing we're going to do is get the bell housing bolts disconnected from the engine. We're on the passenger side. This is the exhaust, and there's 2 bolts on the passenger side here. There's one lower one right here, which was below that bracket that we just removed for the exhaust. And then when you travel upward, there's another one right here. On the top of the transmission, there's 2 other bolts that you can see. In order to get to those, we're gonna have to string together a bunch of extensions to get back far enough to where we could turn a ratchet. And we'll show you how that's done in a second here. On the driver's side, there's one lower one right below the slave cylinder. And then when you go above, there's another bolt here. And that also connects the slave cylinder hydraulic line to the bell housing. All these bolts are 17 millimeter. And like Dan said, some of these bolts are gonna be a different length. So you wanna pay attention where the bolt is coming from so you know where it goes back. We're choosing to go for the 2 upper bolts first because those are the hardest ones to get to. So I have a lot of 1/2-inch drive extensions strung together. I don't know exactly all the sizes, but you just need a lot of them to string them back all the way from the front to behind the transfer case so you can turn a ratchet. So I have my big flex head gear wrench ratchet, and I'm gonna start loosening those 2 upper bolts. One of the extensions is actually a wobble extension, and if you don't know what that is, basically the way the head of the extension is shaped, it allows for a little bit of movement, and that's helping me get onto the head of the bolt a little easier because there's a little bit of give. I don't have to be straight shot on it. So that one's loose. Now we're getting the upper right one on the passenger side, and again we're using the same strung together length of 1/2-inch extensions. And what I did to help me get it onto this one is Dan was holding the back side where I'm actually turning the wrench, and then I got right up underneath the bell housing and got my hand up there and see the socket slipping over the head of the bolt, which helped out. And once I knew it was on there, then I came back and now I'm loosening it up. It's loose now, and then I should be able to spin it out. Don't prematurely pull the extensions off once you got it loose. Use it to get the bolt loose now. The next one I'm going to take out is the upper one on the side of the passenger side. It's right here. I can get onto it with a deep 17 millimeter socket and my flex head ratchet. I'm going to keep on saying this, but these 120 points of engagement ratchets are worth their weight in gold because it allows you can see how much room I have to turn the ratchet between the transmission and the exhaust, and because of all those engagement points I can get it done. So now I got that one loose. I'm going to go for this lower one right here, and that one is free. See if I can get it out with my hand. Yep. And just like we said, we are paying attention to where these bolts are coming from. So as I take them out, I'm telling Dan, hey, this is the upper right, this is the lower left, whatever. You want to keep track. So you can see this is a pretty long one, and this is the bottom one on the passenger side. And then I'm taking out the upper one on the passenger side, and this one also seems like it's pretty long. So now we have 4 of them out. We have 2 more we got to get out on the driver's side. I'm now removing the upper one on the driver's side. I got a couple of the wobble extensions connected together to get easier access. One is like about a 4 or 5 inch one, and the other one's like a 3 inch. Okay, that's loose. Should be able to spin this out with my hand. Okay, you can see that this bolt, it's a little bit of a shorter one, so that is the upper one on the driver's side. The last bell housing bolt that attaches the transmission to the engine is this bottom one on the driver's side, right yonder. And I can just get on this one with no extension, just a deep socket and my 1/2 inch drive ratchet. And I already loosened it. And then I'm gonna back it out with my hand. Now you might be thinking, hey, aren't you putting the cart before the horse? Why did you disconnect the bell housing bolts before supporting the transmission with the transmission jack? And the reason is we still have the transmission connected to the cross member, so the transmission can't go anywhere just yet. And we felt that it was easier to get the bell housing bolts out first while the transmission jack is out of our way, because once the transmission jack is in here, it takes up a lot of space. You'll also notice that once you've got that upper bolt, your slave cylinder lines and slave cylinder are just going to be flopping around. So just hook it on something that's not going to put strain on the line. So it's kind of hooked on the rag joint of the steering right here, and that's good enough for now. We have the transmission jack now underneath the transmission. There's a nice flat spot on the transmission to get an even connection with your transmission jack. And the transmission jack that comes from Harbor Freight has these kind of janky chains, but in order to hold the transmission more securely to the transmission jack, we're using a couple ratchet straps, one on the front and one on the rear. We've got it jacked up underneath, holding a little bit of the weight, and we got the ratchet straps nice and tight. Now what we want to do is we want to get this cross member out from underneath the transmission. The transmission mount is right here, and you have a choice. You can remove a couple bolts on the passenger side here, and then you have a couple more on this driver side, but we're going to go for the ones that attach the transmission mount to the cross member, and you have to go in through these access holes. So when you look inside here, you can see that there's 4 12mm bolts holding the transmission mount onto the cross member. There's 2 in here, and then there's another 2 right in here. So I got my little DeWalt gun, short 3/8 extension, and a 12mm socket, and I'm going to zip these out. And you'll see these are really short. They only have like basically about 1/4 inch of threads. Okay, all 4 bolts that attach the transmission mount to the cross member are free. Now we have to work on getting the 2 bolts on either side that hold the cross member to the frame rails. On both sides of the cross member, you have a 14mm bolt coming in from the rear, and you have a nut going on the front. So I'm going to get on here with my big DeWalt impact gun with a 14mm socket, and I'm going to hold the nut with a 14mm box end wrench, and I'm going to zip these out. You will find that these cross member bolts will fight you a little bit. They're a little bit sticky, and having an impact gun is kind of helpful. You'll do less wear and tear on your arms. I've got 3 of the 4 bolts out. I'm going to get the last one out. You have to wiggle it out. If you have some rust or corrosion, you might have to tap them out because of the rust holding it in there. But now all 4 bolts are out. The cross member is going to be a little bit sticky in these frame members. You might have to use a pry bar, but let's see if I could just wiggle this out, and I can. And it just comes out like so. And it's going to be dropping a lot of debris, so get your eyes out of the path of it. Now we got the cross member out. Before we can separate the transmission from the motor, there's a little access plate, and the bolts face the engine, and it's 4 12mm bolts. There's 2 on the passenger side, and there's 2 on the driver's side. It's going to be really hard to get the camera in there to show you them, but what I'm using to get them loose is just a little flex head box end 12mm wrench. And I'm coming in right above the steering rack, getting my hand between the cross member and the steering rack to turn the wrench. So I got all the 12mm bolts out, and then you could drop this access plate, and this sucker's out. Okay, Dan and I are now trying to shimmy the bell housing free of the motor. There's some alignment dowels we got to get off of, and so we're shimmying it and trying to pull backwards at the same time. Let's see if we can free it. starting to see a little separation. Okay. Stop. It's wobbling back and forth, but it just doesn't seem to want to come off those dowels.
Yeah.
Stop for a second. This is not getting us anywhere, man. So we are having some major difficulty separating the transmission from the engine. We're trying different levels with the transmission jack. We're wiggling it back and forth. We're starting to see some daylight, and what I'm showing you here is the upper part of the bell housing connection to the engine. We got a little bit of a gap, so we have screwdrivers now put in that gap, and now we're going to try to see if we can get a gap on the bottom side, but we're fighting this thing and hopefully we're going to succeed here. But it just doesn't want to disconnect from the engine, and we've got everything disconnected. Using the technique that Dan came up with, we got a little bit of a gap on one end. We got a screwdriver in there, and then we got another gap on another side. We got a screwdriver to maintain that gap, and then we used pry bars where we could, and we finally were able to get it out a little bit more. Where we were prying from the underside is, once you got that access hatch off, you could get the tip of the pry bar on the motor and pushing on the bell housing with the shaft of the pry bar, you're levering it on the cross member underneath the steering rack, if that makes sense. Now we pretty much know we've got it clear of the alignment dowels, and now we can push this back. So I'm going to be pushing with my feet, and then Dan's going to be guiding it with his hands backwards. What's it hitting?
It's hitting up top here, it seems like.
Lower it down?
Lower it down just a hair. Half inch. That's good. That's good.
There it is.
Oh, yeah.
Lower down more.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, she's free.
Oh, look, maybe it's just hung up on this connection for the exhaust bracket. You see that?
Yeah, that's why maybe it said to take that thing out. We might have to go back in and take that thing out. This is a shot from the passenger side front wheel well. We thought we could sneak the bell housing past this part of the exhaust, but we found out the hard way. That's why the factory service manual said to disconnect this. So there's 3 connections. There's one stud here with a 14mm nut. There's another one back over there further forward, and then there's one on this passenger side. There's 3 studs on this side with 3 14mm nuts holding the exhaust together, and you can see the little gaskets right here. This one fought us, and using the impact gun, we ended up breaking off this stud. So we're gonna have to see if we can get another stud and get this stud replaced so he doesn't have an exhaust leak. But now this thing has some play that we could sneak the bell housing past. So the part of the exhaust that was fighting us was this end right here. So now that it's free, it's not rubbing up against the bell housing. If you look, you could see where we were scraping the side of the bell housing. And now we hopefully can just get this transmission pulled back. Let's see now, we can pull this sucker back. Okay. Oh, there it is. Oh. Yeah.
Are we clear now?
Yeah.
Tell you what, let me push up on the back and you push backward on the...
Okay, push up. Yep. There we go. Now let me lower it. Let me lower the overall. You have to push up again now.
Okay.
I'm gonna lower it some more. Okay. You want to come down with it?
All right. Now I'm sitting on this cross member here.
I gotta go up. Lift up on it.
Okay, it's
come forward.
It's clear now.
Okay, let's drop it down.
Okay.
Okay, and a little more.
That's clear there. I can come back some.
All right.
Victory.
Woo, all right.
So here now we have the exposed pressure plate clutch disc. It's certainly worth mentioning and throwing a bit of a disclaimer in at this point. Clutch discs are typically made of really, really nasty stuff, carcinogenic material, asbestos, all kinds of really nasty stuff. So it's kind of well known that any dust and particles that you find in the bell housing and in the surrounding areas can be pretty hazardous. So you should be wearing some kind of protection, a dust mask. I've also seen people use a spray water bottle to settle that dust out. You certainly do not want to be using compressed air to clean any of these parts or these areas, and probably not using air tools at all. Some people even go as far as to say not to use any type of impact tools, as those throw out a bit of dust as well. So just a bit of warning there that realistically you should be protecting yourself from breathing in those carcinogenic particulates. All right, so now that we've got the transmission and everything removed, we will be replacing the clutch fork and the throwout bearing here in the bell housing. And so to get to all that stuff, we're gonna go ahead and remove the clutch fork boot, and that just pops out nice and easily, just like that. This is still in relatively good shape, so I'm going to continue to use this. If this was cracked at all, it would be very easy to replace. It just seats right in here, not necessary to pull the transmission out to replace this piece. So upon inspection here, we can see what is remaining of our Brave pilot bearing, which is completely disintegrated here. We've got some remnant pieces here, and then the remaining are up in the flywheel. We'll pull this off here. We'll need a tool for that. It's wedged on there pretty nicely. And then we'll also be pulling out and replacing the throwout bearing here and the clutch fork as well. So there's going to be a clip you just pull out just like that to disconnect the throwout bearing from the clutch fork, and it just slides forward just like that. And this one looks pretty wasted. There we go. So this pivot point right here gets wedged in by these clips here and held in that pivot point in the fork that you can see is polished from mild wear there. You just kind of need to slide it along so it pops out, and then it will come out here and release. So here we're kind of side by side taking a look at what the old and new clutch fork and throwout bearings look like. This actually needs to be assembled together within the bell housing. We're gonna do it here on the bench just to offer a little clarity on what exactly that looks like. There are some subtle differences in the designs of these throwout bearings. I'm gonna chalk that one up to this being an OEM and this being a center force throwout bearing. By and large, dimensions are the same. We're not gonna have any issues there. This sits here with kind of these contact points making contact with the clutch fork here, just like that. And then this retaining clip is gonna go like this over top of the wings, if you will, of the throwout bearing. So there's kind of one side half on and then the other side, and then we're gonna flip this over and get this properly seated just like that, and then a final push just to get it where it needs to go. We want to make sure that this clip is sitting down inside of the fork just like that. So that looks good. There we go. So something that I neglected to remember to do before I installed the clutch fork and the throwout bearing is that there needs to be just the slightest film of high temp grease or lubricant placed on the pivot points on the fork here and here where it makes contact with the actual throwout bearing, and then also on the back side of this dimple, which is the pivot point, or the fulcrum if you will, so back and forth.
We showed you that the inner race of the pilot bearing was stuck on the input shaft of the transmission, and we used a puller kit that I have from OTC, and we got that race off. We thought we filmed it, we were pretty darn sure we filmed it, but for some reason we don't have the footage. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna enter pretend land, and we're gonna show you how you can use a puller to remove that inner race off the input shaft if the same thing happened to you, which we think could be a very high possibility, because that inner race does get locked onto the input shaft, and maybe your pilot bearing's gonna break apart on you also. So the kit I have is from OTC. It's model 4518. This is a dual bearing splitter type of puller setup. So it has a smaller bearing splitter, and then it has a little bit larger one, and then it has an array of different size rods where you can use it for different applications. So the one we use is the small one because the pilot bearing inner race was pretty small, and then we used a couple of these shorter arms, and then we used this T-bar. We're going to go over to the bench now. We're going to pretend the shaft of this bolt is the input shaft of the transmission, and this nut is the race of the pilot bearing that we have to remove. You get it captured behind the race, and then you tighten up the nuts to where it's capturing the race but not necessarily locked on to the shaft of the transmission. Okay, so that's now behind the nut, which we're pretending is the inner race of the pilot bearing. So now what we do is we get our T-bar and we slide the two rods on either side with a couple washers on top with the nut. And then we line up the holes here and we screw them in to the bearing splitter. Then what we do is we center the rod onto the input shaft of the transmission, which is the shank of the bolt here, and we get it centered on there, and then we get the appropriate size socket or box end wrench, open end wrench, and we start turning this. The force of the rod against the input shaft is going to be drawing the inner race of the pilot bearing off the shaft, and this is the exact way we did it.
Next thing, we're going to be focusing on removing the pressure plate here. We've got a series of 12mm bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we'll go ahead and remove those now. Okay, so I've removed all of the bolts with the exception of the very top one, and the purpose for that is to hold this in place. So as I remove this top one, I'm going to put a hand on this. This has a good bit of weight to it, so certainly do not want that to drop down on me. There we go. This pressure plate does have a tendency to get itself pretty nicely wedged, and so it does take a nice little bit of persuasion here with a pry bar to get it broken loose. I did just get it broken here, so now I'm going to grab it and rotate it by hand. And again, I'm going to focus here where we see these alignment dowels. There we go. Give it another rotation.
You're turning it the right way too.
Alright, we're almost there. Just a section up here feels like needs to be broken loose. There we go.
You got it?
Oop, yep. Alright.
You got that?
Yep, I got it.
Okay.
Okay, so here comes the pressure plate. Along with it, a lot of dust, so super important to have a dust mask on. And then here we have our clutch disc. We'll note the orientation of this. Notice that these springs primarily are facing towards the engine. And then here we have the flywheel and what remains of the pilot bearing. Here's the outer ring. Here's one of the ball bearings, just completely obliterated, which makes the job nice that we don't have to worry about removing that bearing at all, which for a lot of people doing a clutch job can be one of the more temperamental stages of the job. And we've certainly already had enough trouble actually removing the transmission and bell housing mating from the engine, so we're happy to not have to fool with this now. So had this pilot bearing been intact and been snugly mounted here where it's supposed to be, we would have opted to use what's called a blind bearing puller, and there will be a link to this particular kit in the description. This is one of maybe about 10 or so sized pullers. And how this works, as you can see, there's 3 individual sections that get spread. Here we have the new bearing. Had this been here, we would use this puller to insert into the bearing and then crank this open to expand just like that. And you can see how using this tool is vastly superior as to the method that many other people I think use, which is packing behind that bearing with bread and grease and using hydraulic force to pop it out, which can be a huge mess and a huge pain, and it does not always work. So talk about having the right tool for the right job. And this would attach here, and then we have this fly hammer puller giving us that concussive force to remove the bearing that's would be nicely seated in there. One thing to take notice of when we're inspecting this clutch disc, I knew that I needed to replace it based on some symptoms that I was experiencing driving, primarily the slipping of the clutch in third and fourth gear, climbing significant hills in the mountains. Now we can also see that confirmed here by these areas here, essentially are indicators. You'll notice that 1 out of every 4 of these is polished very cleanly silver. So that's essentially wear indication for us on the clutch disc, and you can see that they're grouped in groups of 4. One of them is completely worn. The second one is starting to see indications of wear, and then we also have 2 others that are even deeper still incrementally. And so this is kind of an indication that sure enough our clutch disc is on the way out. Alright, so what we've done here is replaced 2 bolts that we're holding the pressure plate in to give ourselves a little bit of leverage with this pry bar that we've wedged in here on this end. Tim's got it wedged up on the underside of the frame going across here as such in order to hold this in place, prevent it from spinning while we back these bolts out. Alright, so now we're going to show the easy way using an impact gun to break these free. Okay, so notice I've left the top in for obvious reasons to hold that in place and prevent it from falling down onto me. This is another part that has some significant weight to it, so I want to make sure this is well supported before I take this final bolt out. All right, there we have it.
Okay, so here we are. We're looking to get to this input shaft seal, which is behind this, what the factory service manual refers to as a front bearing retainer plate, I believe. In order to get to this, we're first going to go ahead and remove the bell housing, which is a series of 14mm bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. We're going to go ahead and break those free with an impact. Okay, this one's shorter.
That one's shorter.
It's sheared off. Look.
That's 2, huh?
I gotta stop, dude.
Wow.
I barely even put any. It must have been already pretty much broken off with that impact.
Okay, fair warning. Using an impact gun on these bell housing bolts resulted in some broken bolts. Why they broke, we don't know, because the torque spec for these bell housing bolts isn't a high torque spec. And why couldn't you use an impact gun? So we have no clue, but 3 of the bolts sheared off, which isn't good. But now that all the bolts are out, we're just going to take a plastic mallet and tap on the bell housing. We can get it off. There it is. And there's our sheared bolts. One we can grab. Broken, broken, broken. We're probably gonna have to drill these out and re-tap them. Lucky us. Okay, you see all these metal shavings? This was hours of work. Big pain in the We're not 100% sure. By trying to remove the bell housing bolts with an impact was the wrong idea, but we didn't see a problem with removing the bolts with an impact. People do it all the time, but maybe for this application, maybe not the best idea. We did end up breaking off a bolt just with a ratchet and socket. It just seems that the steel bolts want to get really welded into the aluminum threads and are prone to break, I guess. We seen this one other time on the timing belt video where the threads for one of the idler pulleys that screws into the oil pump housing actually stripped on us too, and we didn't do anything wrong. We actually took that out with a ratchet, not an impact. So the seal we were planning on replacing sits right behind this cover. It's a bearing cover. Because we just had a horrible experience with these bolts, we're not going to even try this. We're just going to say screw it. We paid the price. There's two lines of thought. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. This seal wasn't leaking. But there's also the thought process, well, while you're in there, you may as well replace the seal, because if it starts leaking, it's a ton of labor to get back in there. But our gamble did not pay off. We paid dearly on this one. The house won, and we lost big time. We finally got all the broken bolts out after some cursing, and we re-tapped them. They are at M10 with a 125 pitch, and we're going to put this bell housing back on and move to the next step. Fair warning, you've been warned.